Podcast. We are so excited to introduce Leah Brighton. Leah is passionate. She is an advocate for adoptees and the founder of the first adoptee organization in Canada. And what makes it so special is it's established by an adoptee and is for adoptees. Currently, she lives as the serves as the president of the Asian Adoptees of Canada, a nationally registered nonprofit organization that supports the Asian adoptee community, comprising members from across Asia, including many from Korea, China, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and through a dynamic blend of online and personal and in-person events. Hey Claire, hey Leah, welcome.
Hi, Lori. Hi, Leah. So good to have you here with us. I just want to, if it's okay, say a couple of words about Leah before we bring her on. And so I first met Leah a few months ago at a CAD meetup in Toronto, Canada. And you know what? I think it was her warm, energetic, fun personality that I was most drawn to. But also, it was her amazing chiseled arms that made me want to get to know her and talk with her and strike up that first conversation. So, Leah, welcome to the podcast. I'm so thrilled to have this time to chat with you and get to know you some more and also introduce you to our listeners. And I know you're going to make a huge impact with them as well. So, welcome, Leah.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here and so pleased to reconnect with you, Claire, and meet you, Lori, and have this conversation. I love what you're doing and creating opportunities for adoptees, our voices and our stories to be heard.
Awesome, awesome. Well, okay, why don't we just get to know you a little bit? Would you share a little bit about your origin story, maybe any things that stick out for you, and maybe what led you to become an advocate for adoptees?
Sure, yeah. So I was born in South Korea. I was relinquished, and then I grew up in an orphanage from essentially 0 to 4.5. And at that time, orphanages, they were certainly not very well funded, we'll say that. And so I joined and was originally actually a family in the US was going to adopt me. And then I will never know what happened, but that did not move forward. And so I joined when I was 4.5, a family here in Canada. So I grew up in Vancouver, in the sunny seaside city of White Rock. And I grew up, I did my undergrad in linguistics and psychology. I did my master's of science in the Faculty of Medicine in speech language pathology with a minor in audiology. And I practiced for a number of years in as a speech language pathologist. And I worked as a policy advisor in the Senate Leadership Office in Ottawa, which is like our White House as a Canadian translation. And and now I work as an executive communication coach and leadership coach. But for my adoptee journey, I always think it's so interesting, right? Like how our lives can happen kind of in parallel, right? So we have our professional or just, chronological growing up, right? As we like go from like childhood to teenage, adolescence, and adulthood. But our adoptee journey can be on a totally different timeline and plane. So for myself, my adoptee journey was I certainly never really thought much about being an adoptee when I arrived, and certainly when I was younger. And it really wasn't until my oldest brother, so I grew up with two older brothers, and he had a daughter. And at the hospital was everybody. There were, what would be my now niece. She had two grandparents that were like two sets of grandparents that were at the hospital, great grandparent, aunts, uncles, family and friends. And in the waiting room were all of these people so excited for this one human to arrive. And it was exciting, right? Laura, you just talked about your daughter. It's really exciting to have a child. But it was the first time that I thought to myself, wait a minute, were people excited when I arrived? Was anybody waiting for me in a waiting room? Does Korea even have waiting rooms? I really didn't know like anything certainly about my background or much about Korea's medical system, but I certainly saw for the very first time and realized that the arrival of a child is a really big event. And so
Mhm.
that was like the beginning of my own adoptee journey and starting to question, like what was my story? Who was there in the beginnings? Was my birth celebrated or not? And so I did my birth search, and I actually reunited with my birth family when I was 24. So this was back in 2007, just a while ago now. So we can all do the math on that. And then, yeah, and I found out actually that I feel incredibly fortunate because I know so many adoptees are not able to meet their birth family. And yeah, I found out that both my birth parents, so my birth mother, my Oma and Abaji, my birth mom and dad, were not only alive, but they were still married, still in the same house, likely that I would have grown up in. And I have siblings. So are you ready? Do you want to guess how many siblings I have, ladies?
Oh my gosh.
Oh
All
my
right.
gosh.
You guess, Lori.
Mm.
I'm gonna say, oh, I mean the way you just, kind of set that up makes me want to say six, but I'm gonna like tone it down and say four.
Four. Okay, that's a reasonable guess. Yeah.
How
Okay.
many?
I'm not going to spoil it because I think you did tell
Oh, I
me
do.
while we were talking before. I can't remember the exact number, but I'm going to let you reveal. First, drum roll. Drum roll.
We can add that in the edit, a drum roll.
Sarah.
Um, yeah, so I have six older siblings. So you were right
Oh,
in your first guess. So that means I'm number
Wow.
seven. And specifically, so I'm the seventh child, but specifically, I have six older sisters. So
Whoa.
I am the seventh daughter in the whole lineup.
oh my
Wow.
God, get out.
Lucky number seven.
That's
Lucky number
right.
seven. Yeah. So, yeah, it's been, I think it's really interesting, right? Like there are many reasons and histories, for why we're relinquished, the history and context. And I think that's really helpful for people to understand is that we individually as adoptees obviously have our stories that we have lived, but we're embedded within the context of Korea's long history and
Yeah.
like traditions, a war that preceded us, obviously not too long ago, before any of us were born. And then, centuries beforehand with dynasties and everything else. So I think, yeah, it's always like helpful to consider the context that we operate within, not only in our individual lives, but, historically as well. But that
Amazing.
whole experience, as far as in Canada at the time, there were not any certainly adult adoptee organizations. I think as many or some adoptees have experienced, there are some kind of play groups when we're kids that sometimes are organized by our agencies or kind of just loosely formed. But certainly in Canada, there was nothing that was like by an adoptee and for adoptees. And I really feel it's important that as adoptees, we have a different perspective. And when we form different kind of communities or events, how we, yeah, like the substance and kind of the lens in which they operate and unfold is fundamentally different than were it organized by, other parties. And so at the time, the only way that I could really have an adoptee community was I lived in Vancouver at the time in downtown. I was just wrapping up grad school. And so I would join the Asian Adult Adoptees of Washington in Seattle. So that would mean anytime I wanted to be with other adoptees, I would get into my little Honda Civic and I would drive for 4 hours
Oh my
Wow.
gosh.
way to go have dinner.
Oh my gosh.
Wowzers.
Mm. And so then I was like, wow, wouldn't it be great if there was something in Canada?
Mm.
And that was the beginning of my first organization for adult adoptees. Mhm.
That's
Wow.
amazing. I'm so glad that you decided to have this idea. I mean, I absolutely love spending time holding space with other adoptees and just it's very sacred, I think, and there's like this safe space, but also the dynamics you had talked about, like organizations that might be created by um adoptive parents maybe, or like another part of the adoptee constellation besides just for adoptees by adoptees, because I think in my opinion, it kind of shifts the power dynamic and creates a different type of space. And I love the spaces that are created by adoptees for adoptees.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
I think there's I think that the like genesis, like how it begins, whatever, like the organization, how and the seeds of how it is formed are really important.
Mhm.
And who is that leadership? I think that's really important as well. And so yeah, I've really I mean, the adoptee community in Canada is just fundamentally quite different in many respects than say in the US. And we are, I think of us as like seeds, like, scattered around the world.
Oh,
That's like the
yeah.
visual I always have of us. But and part of it is that so in the US, obviously, I think, I'm not sure if this is accurate, but I heard that the US has like 50% of the Korean adoptees who are adopted internationally. I don't know if that's like, I think stats are always hard with adoption, like
Mhm.
adoptees from Korea, because our numbers are really, we're never really certain.
Right.
But in Canada, so as a proportion, right, I would expect that Canada to have, because we're so close,
Mhm.
right? Obviously, their border geographically, but we don't have as many Korean adoptees, I feel, in Canada because Holt wasn't allowed to operate here.
Mhm.
So
Oh.
one of the largest agencies that was part of obviously facilitating adoptions, because they didn't operate here, we our ratio, like the percentage and proportion of Korean adoptees here across the entire country, because we're a massive country geographically, it's not reflected.
Mhm.
And so I think that's like it's an interesting, yeah, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, like how we operate within the context of like histories and as an adoptee within the context of all these systems,
Mhm.
like structures that are put in place that are far outside of my control.
Mhm.
So for myself being an individual adoptee in Vancouver, like looking around wondering, where is my community? Like
Mhm.
where are other adoptees? And it's in part because there wasn't a system that facilitated as many adoptions so that I could have a peer group similar to what was in Seattle, which is, technically 4 hours away, but also only 4 hours away. It's not like
Mhm.
they were in like Germany, like I had to go to, France or Denmark to find another group, which also has like a large group of adoptees. So I think it's always, yeah, I think it's always helpful to consider like the context in which we operate within, but also, Lori, as you were saying, like the spaces, and Claire, like both of you for creating spaces
Mhm.
for adoptees to connect. Mhm.
That's so
Absolutely.
interesting.
I feel that, how like auspicious it was for you, the seed to be planted in Canada, because you followed through on that feeling of wanting community, wanting connection, wanting safe spaces with other Korean adoptees or adoptees in general, potentially. And you saw that that didn't exist. So you were like, I'm going to create it. And I can only imagine how many people's lives have been impacted by that one inspiration and desire and the courage to follow through and create that community that you've been wanting. So thank you, Leah.
Thank you so much, Lori. That's so sweet of you to say, and I hope so. Like I certainly really feel passionately, and I do really hope that it has helped people in their journeys. I would say definitively. So over the last couple of years, the CBC, which is kind of the equivalent to your CNN, or it's our only large national news broadcaster. So they did quite a large story over a series for Queen adoptees in our records. And through that, I've been helping a lot of adoptees, well, even prior to, but with their birth search. So, yeah, there was one adoptee who, I mean, this is public, Miwa, but who I'd helped her with her birth search and like initiating it before kind of the NCRC transition, which we had talked about kind of offline earlier. But it was like the fastest birth search ever. And it was the convergence of all these really stars aligning because her birth family had done 23andMe, which is pretty rare. Like a lot of, Koreans don't necessarily use that DNA set, but it's because they were in the US, I think. So they had immigrated from Korea to the US. And so we had started her birth search in October, and she had a DNA match, I think, in November and met them in
Wow.
December.
Wow.
It was this like this compression, this warp speed of her starting, like even considering her birth search, which was in part because of I was talking about the Asian Adoptees of Canada and some of the work that we had done, and she had reached out, and then executing on that, and then within like less than 4 months, not even 6 months, I think, she reunited. But then, like incredible, as we all know, like that's incredibly rare. Hmm.
Oh my gosh. I just can't even imagine. Personally, I have not um been in reunion with my birth family. But sometimes I wonder, and I hear other adoptee stories like Miwa and yourself, Leah, and I'm like mind blown, like what kind of thoughts, feelings, and emotions would come out. And like, and the timeline of doing that, like, I feel like I need a lot of time and space to process through much of my own story, my own adoption story, and the events and things like that. But to have like such like these events happen so quickly, and then all of a sudden, like you found out you have six older sisters, like that.
Okay.
I just can't imagine. How did you process through that? And like, are you okay?
Yeah, I mean, that's very kind, Claire. Yes, I'm okay. And yeah, it was really amazing. Like in Canada, as I mentioned, I grew up with two older brothers, right? So I'm definitely used to like, kind of the rough and tumble athletic world of having older brothers, which is great. I also never knew what it was like to have sisters. It's very different. And I think regardless of language and culture, it's just very different to have sisters than brothers. is
Yeah.
is really what I learned. But I think one of the biggest things that I saw was like with my biological sisters, because there are just so many of us, that it was so, I think, fascinating to see like slices of me in them,
Mm.
right? And growing up, my minor was in psychology, and at the time, the pervasive like debate was like, is it nature or is it nurture? And I think as an adoptee, that's a question that I've had, for a long time growing up. And the pervasive narrative has been like, your nurture, like your DNA doesn't matter, right? Like, which is wild. Like, we are obviously Korean. You
Mhm.
cannot really deny how important your DNA is just in how you look, let alone in like who you are as a human.
Mhm.
But yeah, and so seeing the dominant the story I've been told is that what matters most is like nurture your environment, right? The family that you grew up in, the language that we speak, the culture that were immersed in, etc. Which is obviously incredibly important as well, right? My English,
Yeah.
pretty good, I think. My Korean, not as great. I can order some food, ask for water, But by meeting my sisters, as far as Claire, your question of like what that was like,
Hmm.
it was really, it was so wild to see pieces of like me and my personality in my sisters, where we didn't necessarily like share the same language, certainly our culture and background, right? I grew up in Canada. They are obviously in Korea, but there were still these slices that I saw reflected of me in them.
Mm.
And then in some ways it made me think, wow, there has always been pieces of me in Korea
Mhm.
that I didn't know. Even though I physically am here in Canada, these slices of like my personality and my being are in obviously my birth parents, my oma and my apaji, my mom and my dad, but also in these six women, right? My six sisters, plus my 10 nieces and nephews.
Wow.
Wow. That's pretty profound.
True, yeah.
Truly profound. Would you be willing to share what are some of those attributes? What are some of those slices of your being that you just naturally are within your DNA within, who you are, and what parts do you see reflected back to you in your sisters and in your biological family?
Yeah. I mean, I think lots of traits, right? Whether it's, I think they're very bright. Like, I think my Kanoni is like really, like, incredibly clever, like really resourceful. And, they're really funny. I think it's, even though we don't speak the same language, we can definitely still like laugh and understand each other in a way that is kind of when as somebody, I love language. I love language. It was my major in undergrad. I'm a speech pathologist by training. But I think it's really wild how we can communicate and understand each other through like, GIFs or images or emojis or like at the time, very rudimentary translations. Like when I first met them back in 2007, Papago or Google Translate were really not options. It was still not, if you gals will remember with me, it was a T9 phone, which is what I had to navigate Korea back in 2007.
Oh my God.
Right.
Wow.
There wasn't, I mean, there was Wi-Fi, but I didn't have a smartphone when I visited. I just had a T9. So it was like that was it. But even with like sketching out, I had a sketchbook that I had with me when I was like trying to draw things out for them to like talk to them. And yeah, it was, I think even still, right? My Korean is still really not great. Um, but we can still communicate. Yeah, it's hard to describe in the sense that we can still communicate as though like across through like osmosis, across like language and across culture, right? Even though we don't speak the same language, because it's as though we can just connect the dots. It's not perfect, so asterisk. This, by no means do I mean to say we have the same kind of conversation and fluency like the three of us are having right now. Absolutely not.
Right.
Would I love that? Certainly, right? Um, but I do find that it's really like fascinating. Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating. And something that I noticed, Leah, which I love about you, is that you communicate a lot with your hands, your body language. And I think that is so much of the essence of communication beyond just the linguistics, the language part. So even though there is that language barrier between you and your sisters and your family, I almost feel like maybe this was a taught skill that you picked up throughout your career and learning about communication, but I almost feel like the body language and the expressions on your face and your hand gestures, they almost communicate more than just the actual language.
Yes, I agree that body language, gestures, etc., the nonverbal communication, which is what we categorize that as, is huge. Some studies and researchers say that it's even more important than your verbal communication. But ideally to have both, that's best.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd love to ask you, Leah, how did your adopted family feel, respond, or react when you were in unification with your biological family?
Yeah, I think that's always like an interesting journey because everybody within the adoption triad has, and the triad actually is like much more multifaceted than just three. But, I feel like I feel what's really helpful for adoptees to consider is that we will all have our own interpretations of different stories and events. And what I have found for a lot of adoptees is that they have held back from, say, doing a birth search or even going to Korea or even going for Korean food, right? And like recognizing and embracing their identity. I remember there was one adoptee who she'd come to an event and she was there, she was excited, but she refused to use chopsticks because like for her, that was like the line in the sand where she just couldn't, she felt like that was like beyond what she wanted to embrace for like her own cultural identity or, which is fine, right? I think yeah, I think certainly in my role, it's recognizing that everybody has their own, place or boundaries that they are, and it's up to people, it's up to individuals to navigate wherever they might be on that continuum. And
Mhm.
so, I think it's really helpful. Yeah, I guess for myself, I always I always think that there's so much possibility for adoptees to learn more about who they are if they relieve themselves of like the permission that they feel like they need to ask for or be granted or anointed. Know?
Yes.
And I think that,
Yes.
I mean, I see that a lot for even, ambitious professionals who I work with in, my life now, right? So many times within like the corporate world as well, people can feel like they have to be anointed for an opportunity or a promotion or career advancement in whatever capacity. And I think, well, I know for myself, I really believe in your own volition, right? Your own like center of like drive or, you know, in psychology, they call it like your locus of control. Like, do you feel like you have the ability to decide as an engine to move forward? Or do you feel like you have to wait for other people to grant it for you?
Mhm.
And so like an internal decision or an external decision. And I think that it's really important because as I'll say for myself, as an adoptee, there are lots of different voices and people who have perspectives about what is right or what you should do and who you should ask for permission and have an anointment from or whatever else. And I really just feel that as adoptees, time is really important. Like, had I waited until, I was much later in life, because I was in my 20s at the time, to do a birth search, my birth parents would have passed away, you know? And so time is definitely a factor in general in life, but I think especially as adoptees, because the time if we do reunite with our birth family can be so precious. Like it can just be like second in comparison to, kind of the length of our lifetime. Yeah.
I love that. That's such an empowering perspective to have, and something that I have been very aware and conscious of moving forward in my life, my identity, and also my relationships. Just that validation of myself by myself. Like I don't have to wait for other people to validate or to give me permission. And it's almost like, I've been granted the green light to give myself that permission to go for whatever it is my hopes, goals, and dreams are. And no one else is there to say, oh, yeah, that's okay if you do that, because I no longer have shifted the power from outside of me. I've shifted it to within me. And so I really align with what you're doing in your work, Leah. And I think it's amazing. And I would love to hear more about that, particularly about like if I think as an adoptee, some of my own subconscious patterns or behaviors are so rooted in my like self-limiting beliefs about what I can accomplish and what my identity is. And how have you helped to, for some of your clients, to overcome some of those self-limiting beliefs and really go for whatever it is that they want?
Yeah. So I think that, Claire, that's a great question. And I feel that so much of our lives can be um we can be told who we are, right? There's a story that we have been told, right? Whether as an adoptee, we've been told that we've been rescued, right? And whatever that narrative might be, for better, for worse, that is the common narrative in Hollywood, or I call it the Hallmark and Hollywood narrative.
Mm.
Um, but a lot of times for ambitious, bright professionals, they're also told a certain story. Maybe they're told like, you're not ready, you don't have the skills, you need another degree, an MBA, maybe even a PhD. I don't know if maybe if you have been ever told this, right? I call it the rings of fire, right? You need to jump through this another hoop of fire, ring of fire, before you can get a promotion or a pay raise or be a manager or director or VP or whatever, right? And what I really think is so important is for people to know that they get to choose, right? There will always be other voices that might tell them certain limiting beliefs, but it's their choice to say whether they grant that story permission to have control over them or not. And I think that's really important for individuals to know and to come to that understanding that despite what the external world might say, you as an individual have so much power and autonomy to decide. And maybe that also comes like as an adoptee, right? There have been so many external forces. I didn't decide, obviously, whether I was adopted to Canada or the US or the family, growing up with two older brothers, you know, having a family dog, right? Like these weren't things that I decided, but I got to decide a whole host of other things, including professions, people in my life, the Korean adoptee community, the adoptee community in general. And so I think for ambitious professionals who really want more, it's in part mindset, definitely like what you've talked about, and understanding that you can decide, but it's also skill set, like knowing how to do it. And there was one individual I was working with, he was saying like, people always talk about, your net worth is your net, or your network is your net worth. But he's like, I don't know how you actually make that happen. It's a fun phrase, but what does it actually mean?
Right?
Yeah. And so it's also knowing, when I work with people, it's like translating that so that it can actually increase your net worth, right? Your opportunities, your income, and everything else. And so, yeah, I believe that maybe similar as a parallel to my adoptee journey, it's knowing not only internally, like who you are and what you want, but also how to get there. Yeah.
That is key, for sure. That is so key. Yeah, so I have a follow-up question to that. Like you talked about building these skills and knowing how to get there, not just, saying, I want this, I'm going to manifest this into my life. I think we all can agree that that just doesn't work in the real life. Like you have to actually take steps to start to become that version of yourself, to empower yourself to have these skills and behaviors that future version of yourself is going to be able to achieve those goals, right? So, what are some of the tools that you would recommend, or maybe things that you have done to empower yourself to work on some of these skills? Like, I know you're great at communication and linguistics. What are some other tools that maybe you could recommend some of our listeners to look into to help themselves in this area?
Yeah. I mean, I'd say for professionally, what I know consistently, if you actually want to advance your career, Warren Buffett said, if you want to give yourself a 50% raise, you should work on your written and communication and verbal communication, right? It's the easiest way to give yourself a 50% raise. And that compounds because that's not just like your first opportunity, but your next as well. So I certainly know how important that is. But also I'd say, really understanding like more of what team dynamics looks like, right? And being able to like connect with those around you, what your vision is, what your intentions are, where you're driving kind of forward. I think I know how critical that is as people ascend, I'd say, within their professional journey. But I also think it's, in this world of AI that we're in right now, for whatever it might be professionally, I do really feel that one of the key important differentiators as we're looking, and I sincerely, I mean, I see trends on LinkedIn and trends in hiring in general, but I feel that what will be increasingly important are, our human skills, right? Like what makes us human, because we'll have now all of these, whether it's, the big thing now is like AI agents or whatever else to help with our work. So those agents and technology will do like the heavy lifting for like what classically has been like data processing or, um, large like research roles, right? So like whether it's accounting or anything else, building out financial models, et cetera. And so to be able to actually like harness our human qualities of communication, of connection, that will be a core skill set that I feel like will become increasingly important. But even like so that's like, I mentioned as far as like parallel processing, right? So as an adoptee, there are like different skill sets that I think are important as far as like navigating that adoptee journey, right? And a lot of that really, I mean, that stems a lot from why I have been so active and, an advocate for adoptees and understanding how important community and connecting with other adoptees has been in my own adoptee journey. and learning about myself, right? And understanding that I certainly had the benefit of other adoptees who had also done birth searches prior to me, in the generation before me, and what that experience was like, and how to continue to advocate to yourself with your adoption agency, you know? And then navigating the reunion experience. And then I also feel very fortunate in the sense that I have an ongoing relationship with my birth family, right? It wasn't like a one-time meeting and then I never saw them again. So I feel incredibly thankful for that as well. And yeah, I think that the lived experience and that historical knowledge is a large part why, I started the adoptee community here in Canada and why I continue to serve the adoptee community here in Canada. And it's been really interesting because now there's this whole other wave of adoptees, right, who are just beginning their own awakening. I think 2020 and, the pandemic when the world was shut down and a lot of people had much more time to be introspective. Okay. It's part of your journey, your moment as well. But
Yeah.
because I received a lot of inbound requests from adoptees in their own reflection of their adoptee journey during that time when we were all in lockdown and the world kind of had a moment to pause. And now, I mean, this weekend we're celebrating Lunar New Year's. And we have like 30 people who have RSVP to join us for our celebrations. And, they're like Chinese adoptees, which is a really large contingent for the Asian Adoptees of Canada, because I think it's one of the largest sending countries in Canada that we received over the last 90s and into the 2000s.
Okay.
And Korean adoptees as well. Mhm.
Amazing. And yeah, by the way, Happy New Year. Happy
Ooh,
Salal
Happy
to
New Year to
both
you.
of you. I love that. I love that. And I so wish that I could be a part of your event this weekend. But I think it's amazing what you're doing for the community. And as far as adoptee awareness and advocacy, what topics or maybe social matters matter to you the most? And what drives you to help other adoptees?
Oh, do I have to pick just one, my friend?
You can talk about as many as you want.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think I feel really passionately about birth search and reunion. I think that us being able to have access to our own records and our own origin stories and who we are is really important. I spent a lot of time with a lot of different adoptees in their birth search because it's just not. In the most emotionally generous, flexible version, I recognize how nuanced it is for every adoptee, right? Because every adoptee has such a different journey. I mean, one adoptee, she found out that her birth mom actually told her adoption agency that she was moving to Thailand, and now she works in Thailand. So now I've been helping her to try and do a birth search to find her birth mother in Thailand, who lives, she thinks, in Bangkok, but she's not sure, which is totally different than, another adoptee who, for what she knows, was like born and grew up or spent some time in an orphanage in Seoul, right? Or, another adoptee, her birth family, she's an American adoptee, and her birth family, she found out that they actually are somewhere in Canada. They immigrated to
Oh,
Canada, after she was relinquished. So, all of these different nuances for how to do a birth search, it is really challenging because there are so many different variations for what our stories can look like. But I do really feel passionately for adoptees to have that opportunity, which, in part why we mentioned earlier, like the NCRC and that whole transition and migration, I think is really challenging in thinking about, how does a country manage all of these files? Korean, the number that has been said for the last 20 years has been 200,000 Korean adoptees, which I think is probably outdated.
yeah,
I don't know how
agree.
the
Absolutely.
same number for 20 years has been circulated when I definitely know that there have been adoptions happening throughout those 20 years.
Yeah.
But I understand like one anyways. So yeah, I do think that as far as something that I feel passionately about is adoptees having that opportunity to do a birth search and to do reunion. I also feel really, really passionately for adoptees here in whatever, receiving country that we grew up in, to have the opportunity to connect with our community, right? To actually, have like celebrate Lunar New Year's, with peers, to eat our food for the first time, since we may or may not have grown up in the orphanage or foster family in Korea or China or Vietnam. And every year that, we've had a Lunar New Year celebration, there's always at least one adoptee where it's their first time celebrating ever. And to me, what that really shows is how important community is. Even with the internet, even with YouTube, even with, meetup groups, right? Meetup.com or whatever else, or tons of other meetups. Having a specific adoptee space led by, organized by, facilitated by an adoptee is so important, because it shows that we can assume that we don't maybe need this anymore because there is internet, there is YouTube, there is, TikTok or wherever you might be. But the truth that I consistently see is that it is so important to give adoptees these spaces and opportunities so that we can connect. And so that maybe somebody celebrates for the first time, right? Or for the 20th time, for whatever our celebrations might be. So yes, those are things that I really, certainly within the adoptee community, feel really passionately about.
Thank you so much, Leah, for feeling passionate and actually creating spaces and being able to reach out. I would love to tap into your personal expertise and experience a little bit about my birth search and story. May I?
Sure, of course.
So I went to South Korea in 2015 on a heritage tour by Holt. And part of that tour, they have you get to have the experience of sitting with a social worker and looking over your file. And when I looked over my file with the social worker, they said, "Sorry, there's no information here." And all it really said is my birth name and that I was abandoned and that I was around 4 or 5 years old. And I kind of just thought, well, at least I tried, it's okay. And because I really didn't go into it with expectations. But then with, more information and light upon that subject with the documentary, the Frontline documentary that came out, do you think that it's worth for me to do like a real birth search, even though I've been told and given that file of information from your personal experience of helping other adoptees with their own birth searches?
Yes. I mean, that's a very short answer, but no, it's 3 letters. But I definitely would say so. So I mean, for my experience, right, I'll say it took months. Like so I know I told the early story of Miwa, where it was like essentially from decision to reunion, it was like 3 months. It was over like 6, 7 months for me before I actually got anything back from my adoption agency. And it was a lot of following up, waiting. There was a maternity leave. Somebody churned. I think I went through, I lost count of how many social workers that I was shuffled through
Oh,
when I
wow.
when I emailed, because it was just like a very small email for post-adoption services. It's changed now. Actually, yeah, I've been watching, I should have documented it more throughout the last year when a lot more kind of light and attention was being given to Korea, how much the post-adoption services website or page on that website changed. But for yourself, I would certainly encourage you to try again. And whether it's having somebody in Korea help you, right? So there are, different adoptee organizations that can help with that birth search as well. I do know that right now part of the challenge is that because of the NCRC transition, I don't know like how Holt is for whether they're accepting people initiating or continuing a birth search. Because I've heard that some agencies are simply waiting in a holding pattern until July, and then kind of waiting to see what happens there. So, but I have heard, I mean, I know some adoptees who have been told something similar, like there's nothing here, and then they've gone back again, asked again, or had somebody help translate for them again. And they found like a very different story. So I say that, and I don't want to, you know, plant the seeds for something that could, it might be, it might be there is nothing, but it could be
Mm-hmm.
something else totally different as well. And I think it's
Absolutely.
helpful to know, like, I'm not like automatically implying every time somebody says that there's nothing in there that there is something, but I
Mm-hmm.
also definitely have seen there to be more than what has initially been disclosed or shared. Mhm.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leah. I definitely feel that it's worth the curiosity
Mhm.
to be able to just try, investigate, find out more information. And I don't really have expectations, which is really helpful because of the work that I've been able to do within myself, within my own agency and choice and power. I don't feel like I need that external validation of my birth family to give me permission to be fully me and to be whole and happy. But man, it sure would be cool to find out if maybe I got some sisters, I got some brothers, eat some yummy Korean food. And yeah, so I'm open to being curious. And thank you for your uh, encouragement to just be open and try and continue doing the birth search because I have the opportunity to, as a Korean adoptee, and the right to know that information.
Yes, I agree. Definitely. Mhm.
Oh, Lori, thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, I wish you the best on your journey. And I really resonate with some of the things that you said about not being tied or having expectations, not being tied to the outcome. And I have a similar feeling about my birth search and my journey as an adoptee is just really more about enjoying and embracing the journey and learning some of the messages that come up from finding information or learning more from other adoptees or learning more about the processes of the birth family search and things like that. For example, I went to Korea. I traveled over this past summer, and I spent time at my orphanage, the Star of the Sea orphanage, just kind of it was my second visit back, and then I spent time at KWS, the agency, the adoption agency, and I talked to one of the social workers there and reviewed my file. And then I just kind of connected with other adoptees over there and learned more about their journey as well. So for me, that has been like everything. It's just learning about myself through this process, through this journey. And who knows if I will be in reunion one day, but I feel kind of similar way to you, Lori, is not like my joy and happiness and peace doesn't depend on that, but it's more about like what can I learn from this process and this journey along the way. Yeah. Leah, I
Beautiful.
wanted to ask you another question. This might be
Sure.
off topic, but I'd love to just know more about you. Like, what are you passionate about? Like, maybe outside of adoption or outside of your career? Like, what other types of things light you up inside, bring you joy and peace?
Well, I really love art a lot. I also just feel like art is another way of communicating, though. And so I think it's like so wildly fascinating to think about. Van Gogh is one of my favorite artists. And so when you look at his work, I think of it as, any artist's work is like their vision of the world, like how they see the world. Obviously he didn't see it as like an impressionist painting, like distorted. But yeah, I really think that the perspective that art has to show a different view of what the world could be is like so beautiful and so amazing. So I really love art. I also really love language. Just in general, I was watching this, it sounds ridiculous. I was watching this language documentary because that's normal. But I was and they said, I can't remember which language it was, but for I love you, right? Which is a very nice phrase, obviously. But in that language, it wasn't, their version of I love you was I see you.
Oh,
Mm.
So to communicate that you have that feel like that level of like, connection with somebody isn't just, well, I don't say like isn't just, but isn't exclusively like a feeling, but it's specifically like seeing somebody, And like for me, what I hear is like it's a translation of like seeing and accepting and embracing like all of who they are.
Mm.
And I'd say for myself, as an adoptee, it's like, wow, I think that's part of the power of community is to like when you meet other adoptees, you can really see them.
Mm.
And maybe you can see yourself in them as well, right? And what our journeys could be. I often feel like I don't know if you folks have ever felt like this, but whenever I meet another adoptee, I was just talking to another adoptee from Sweden, and I just think that you are me and I could have been you.
Mm.
Like our files, because that's really all it was, is like somebody in the agency picked my file. I was at a time when you could pick, approximate age and gender and health for a child. I don't think you can do that anymore. But so I checked a whole bunch of boxes, right? And somebody picked my file. But just the same, what if rather than my file, they picked my friend's file in Sweden and she ended up in Canada
Mm.
and I ended up in Sweden? And so I just think it's so fascinating to think about how interchangeable in some ways all of us are, even the three of us. What if you two ended up, either one of you were in Canada and I ended up in the US,
Oh my gosh.
right? And it's this like different level of like seeing, I think, like as an adoptee, whether I meet like Chinese adoptees or Vietnamese, like all of the different adoptees, like there's some Filipino adoptees who are part of our community as well. And it's this like sense of like seeing somebody and like knowing what that means, right?
Mm.
And I just feel like as a community, that's like a different level that like really resonates than just like meeting somebody at like some networking event.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Wow, I feel that like full body chills while you were describing this concept, and that's just a beautiful way to I guess to explain it. But I have felt that also. And I think for me it's being able, it's this space, like I said, this sacred space where I feel truly safe to show up as me, express me the way that I want to, the way who I feel I am, which I never had growing up. I always felt I wore a mask. I had to hide who I truly was because I wouldn't be accepted, loved, or whatever. And so for some of these spaces, which I think for me, it's like one of the biggest benefits and reasons why I keep coming back and joining them and supporting these spaces is because I can feel like truly feel myself, like my authentic self. And when we live in alignment with our authentic self, then it brings us much more peace and joy and happiness. And I feel empowered. Yeah.
I love it. Yes,
Yay.
all those reasons. I mean, what you just described, Claire, is like why I think the community is so important,
Mhm.
you know, and why I think having also, whether it's like in person or online, right? Because there are some people who don't have the privilege of being in a major city or in a hub with a lot of other adoptees. Like a lot of adoptees, whether it's through work or, through family, they just live in much more remote places. Canada is just so geographically dispersed.
Mhm.
We just don't have as many large urban centers like the US does.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, like being able to feel like you can truly be all of who you are. So you are seen and celebrated, I think is so important.
Mm. Yes. Celebrate it. To be seen, to be supported exactly as you are. It's so important because a lot of people I know feel like they have spaces like that. And that's why I think it's awesome that we create spaces like that. Leah, you create spaces like that. And I wonder that are you still driving 4 hours to Washington to have dinner?
I still would on occasion, but I live in Toronto now. So I
Uh,
moved from when I was a speech language pathologist, I lived in Vancouver, and then when I was a policy advisor, I lived in Ottawa, which is across the country, close to close to Washington, I guess, DC.
Mm-hmm.
And now I live in Toronto, which is close to New York.
Mm.
So it would be an even further drive were I to drive from Toronto to Seattle, Washington.
Absolutely. Well, we'll definitely let you know if we do a adoptee empowered retreat in upstate New York sometime. Maybe you can drive down and have dinner with us or join us for the retreat.
I would love
Yeah.
that. Yeah, I love New York. I was just in New York actually. There was the Adoptee Leadership Conference, ALE, because I serve on ICA as well. So I was just in New York last year in June, and I love New York. I mean, I've been to New York so many times. It's always a wonderful, diverse, busy city. Great art as well. Great art and
Mm.
city.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
absolutely.
I second that.
Uh-huh. Leah, so if one of our listeners or many of our listeners want to get in touch with you or maybe want to attend one of your speaking engagements or conferences that you'll be a part of, where can we expect you to be in the next year or so?
Sure. Yeah. Well, for the adoptee community, the easiest way to keep up with the Asian Adoptees of Canada is online. And if to learn more as far as like my professional work and life, that's just at dreamcareertoday.com.
Nice.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Leah, for taking time to be with us here on the podcast and being able to share your experience and your stories, your expertise, and for creating safe spaces for adoptees in Canada. And we're just so excited to see what you're going to do next.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited as well for Canada and for the adoptee community as a whole. Like I think kind of as we mentioned, kind of threading throughout our conversation here is that um, is that I feel that the adoptee community at large is at such a unique inflection point where there's Chinese adoptees and obviously the change that happened there with the announcement last year, Korean adoptees with NCRC and the migration for our paperwork, et cetera. So I feel that, where we are is like a really unique place. I also realized if people just want one place to find me, LinkedIn is where I live. So I met Leah Kim Brighton on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest way to find me is I post a number of things about work and also the adoptee community here in Canada as well. That's
Mm.
probably
Awesome,
what you were
Leah.
asking. That's about a better place.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here and sharing your time and all of you with us and opening up with our community. It's been so helpful and impactful for me, I'm sure, as many others. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more from you and learning from you in the future. I'm going to connect with you on LinkedIn and hopefully we'll meet up again in person sometime. Would love that.
I look forward to it. And thank you so much to you both for having me and this fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed.